Welcome back to Central Colorado Ballistics. My name is Wally. Most conversations about the Second Amendment start in 1791. They start with the words on the page. But history didn't begin there. Long before the Bill of Rights existed, governments were already deciding who could own weapons, who should carry them, and who absolutely should not. So, before we talk about infringement, before we talk about regulation, before we talk about rights, we have to talk about control. In early America, firearms were not symbolic. They were survival tools. In the colonies, owning a firearm wasn't optional. In many places, it was mandatory. Colonial governments required able-bodied men to own arms, to train with them, to bring them to militia musters. This wasn't about liberty. It was about defense. Defense from foreign powers. Defense from raids. Defense from chaos. In other words, an armed population wasn't feared. It was expected. But here's where things get complicated. Not everyone was trusted with weapons. The question wasn't caliber. It was character, as defined by the government. Colonial law routinely disarmed people considered dangerous. That included those who refused loyalty oaths, those suspected of rebellion, those outside the accepted social order. This is important. Early firearm regulation targeted people, not technology. There was no magazine limits, no bans on features, no list of approved weapons. The concern was always the same. Who holds power and who might challenge it? This is where modern assumptions can mislead us. Yes, class existed in early America, but not in the way we think about it today. There was no formal middle class. There were landowners, laborers, indentured servants, and the enslaved. Firearms cost money. So naturally, wealth influenced access. But class alone didn't determine legality. Trust did. A poor farmer could legally own a musket. A wealthy man could be disarmed if deemed disloyal. This tells us something critical. Early gun control wasn't about economics. It was about obedience. The American Revolution broke something open. An armed population turned on its government and won. The fact terrified future governments. and inspired citizens. For the first time, widespread civilian arms weren't just tolerated. They were vindicated. But independence created a new problem. How do you form a government without becoming the thing you just overthrew? The Second Amendment wasn't written to create gun ownership. It was written to protect something that already existed. A deeply armed population, a distrust for centralized authority, a fear of standing armies. The founders didn't ask whether people should own arms. They assumed they already did. The real question was this: how do we prevent future governments from deciding they trust themselves more than the people? This is where nuance matters. The Second Amendment didn't end regulation. States still passed laws. Local governments still enforced rules. But there was a shift. Power was fragmented. No single authority could disarm everyone. And that tension between authority and autonomy never went away. If you step back, a familiar pattern appears. Fear, control, justification. Then time passes. The justification fades, but the restriction remains. This pattern didn't start in the 20th century. It started at the very beginning. So this is where our story pauses briefly. Because the next chapter doesn't happen in Congress. It happens on the frontier. In territories governed by distant authorities, among people who had no vote, but were still subject to the rules. Western expansion didn't invent gun laws. It stress tested them. And nowhere is that clearer than in the territory that would become Colorado. Because before there were state laws, there were rules imposed on people who couldn't vote against them. Freedom secured, rights defended.